Phase out or just phase down? Most climate scientists say fossil fuels have to go in order to curb global warming. But at COP28 in Dubai, is it still up for debate? With the lofty goal of capping global heating at 1.5 degrees, is there a place for hydrocarbons? And could our economy survive without them? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is COP28. Since 1995, the UN has organized its annual climate conference with the goal of limiting global warming and mitigating climate change. And every year, activists say nowhere near enough is being done. This year in Dubai, we've seen more of the same, with an added controversy of the host country, the UAE, being a major producer of hydrocarbons. Leaked documents showed the Emirates had plans to negotiate oil and gas deals during the talks. And another report exposed the UAE was illegally burning waste gas that was spreading toxic pollution across the region. We'll debate the value of COP28 in just a minute, but first, a look at the conference so far.
This year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP28, kick-started on a promising note, with attendees reaching a principal agreement to fund poor countries affected by climate disasters. Delegates also confirmed more than $2 billion will be committed to preserving forests, oceans, and defeating neglected tropical diseases. The conference took place at a time when the planet is experiencing the hottest year in recorded human history, which scientists attribute to a lethal cocktail of, quote, greenhouse gas emissions mainly caused by burning of fossil fuels.
Allow me to have a message for fossil fuel company leaders. Your old road is rapidly aging. Do not double down on an obsolete business model. Lead the transition to renewables using the resources you have available. Make no mistake, the road to climate sustainability is also the only viable pathway to economic sustainability of your companies in the future.
Despite the overwhelming evidence, there are those who beg to differ, and that difference in opinion has caused much controversy. COP28 President and United Arab Emirates Minister of Industry and Advanced Technology, Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber, thinks there is no need to scratch fossil fuels completely. He argues there is no science indicating a removal of fossil fuels is needed to restrict global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Al-Jaber also says a phase-out of fossil fuels would not allow sustainable development unless you want to take the world back into caves. The comments are said to be borderline climate denial in nature by some. They are also at odds with Guterres' views, which are that to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, the world has to completely stop burning all fossil fuels. Former Ireland President and one-time UN Special Envoy for Climate Change, Mary Robinson, believes the one big decision that COP28 can produce is to phase out fossil fuels. For the record, more than 100 countries already support that. But oil-producing nations veto language calling for a rapid phase-out of fossil fuels, and the irony is oil and gas company representatives are said to have a heavy presence at the conference.
Well, the huge presence of fossil fuel lobbyists has led many to question the point of COP28. One climate activist likened it to inviting arms dealers to a peace summit. So let's ask our panelists if COP28 actually adds value to the cause of combating climate change. Joining me now from Dubai, the head of global political strategy at Climate Action Network International, Harjeet Singh. From Washington, climate activist and founder of Wake Up, Jerome Foster II. He's also the youngest member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And from Dubai again, the founder and CEO of Climate Analytics, Bill Hare. Thanks all so much for being with me. Harjeet, I'll just start with you. I mean, is the irony just kind of absurd here that a leader of a country whose economic foundation is built on the fossil fuel industry is actually presiding over a climate conference where the overwhelming consensus is that the use of fossil fuels needs to be phased out as quickly as possible, why would he be expected to preach the end of an industry that underpins his own nation's economy?
Absolutely, Andrea, and that's exactly the kind of question we asked when he was elected to lead the COP28 deliberations. And we demanded that he should be stepping down from the post of CEO of ADNOC, because when we know that fossil fuels are cause of the climate crisis, how can you allow head of an oil company to lead the climate conversation? And this is something that we have been saying. If you continue to pursue the interest of fossil fuel industry, we will never be able to deal with the climate crisis that is upon us right now. And here we are hearing 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists roaming around just to prolong the use of fossil fuels and make much more profits than we are already making, and actually wreck the planet.
Okay, Jerome, you're not at COP28. Did you want to be?
The vast majority of a lot of the individuals that are at COP28 this year, around 2,400 of them being fossil fuel lobbyists directly against the aim of decarbonization and a just transition away from fossil fuels. So I think it's a lot of issues, a lot of things that we need to tackle in order for COP29 to be a reversal of these very harmful human rights abuses that we're seeing at COP28.
You know, Jerome, you are actually specifically, though, disappointed in a lot about COP28. But as I said, specifically, you're disappointed in the U.S. president not attending. What did that say to you and your fellow activists?
President Biden's decision not to attend COP28, I think, is a really key misstep, because the United States has a historic responsibility to be at the table because of his history of leading the pollution of our planet. And I think for President Biden to not be at COP28 and to be in these really key discussions about how do we make sure that we are decarbonizing, setting an example, and leading in the fight to end the climate crisis, it's sad to see that a lot of the commitments that he's talking about in being a climate president isn't being fulfilled in this way.
You know, before the conference kicked off, former U.S. Vice President and environmentalist Al Gore, he had something interesting to say about the host of COP28. I'd like to listen to that quickly.
When Sultan al-Jaber says the fossil fuel companies should collaborate with policymakers to advance progress, not impede progress, who's he kidding? Do they take us for fools? Don't they realize we can see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears that they are impeding progress?
Bill, let me come to you. He's obviously very passionate, and he makes an interesting point. But let me ask you this. Is it fair for the former vice president of the world's biggest polluter, the United States, to demand oil producers change their behavior when the U.S. is still arguably the biggest consumer of fossil fuels and still has its own production? So, I mean, there's kind of this double standard and a bit of hypocrisy on every end of this.
Well, that's right. I think there's more than enough hypocrisy to share around the world, really. I think, and Al Gore makes a good point, that there's a very deep conflict of interest with the present COP president hosting it, given his oil interests. That's absolutely certain. But other countries also share the blame in continuing to expand oil and gas production particularly, and others continuing to proceed with business as usual. I mean, I wanted to just focus on the main thing we need to do here, which is to try and get an agreement on a fossil fuel phase out. And I agree with all of the concerns about climate justice, etc. I've worked on that for years myself, but we really need to focus now on, will this COP president step up? He's been heavily criticized the last weeks in the media. A lot of his views have been exposed. He's defended them. The challenge now is he's got to rise above that, representing the 198 or so plus countries here to actually take us forward. And everyone in the scientific community is saying the only real way we can take this forward is actually getting a phase out of fossil fuels. We get carbon dioxide emissions to zero, we can pretty quickly stop warming. We can only do that by getting a phase out of fossil fuels. And I think that's the challenge for the next week ahead now.
He wants to phase it down bill, and you talk about getting an agreement. The last agreement, proper accord we had was the Paris Climate Accord, and COP28 is supposed to be the first real global assessment of that accord. So, I mean, how are we faring?
Well, look, absolutely correct. I mean, at Paris, we agreed, some really important things. The 1.5-degree limit was important, but we also agreed a 5-year stock take. This is the first one, and all the scientists are saying that we're way off track. So the stock take is not looking good, and we simply have to step up and move everything forward. So the challenge now at this COP is to get this stock take into position and essentially get an agreement on a fossil fuel phase out.
Harjeet, let me come back to you because is Sultan Al-Jaber, in a sense, though, just being honest? And that whether we like it or not, fossil fuels are kind of here to stay for the foreseeable future because, as he said, it would cause too much socioeconomic damage to stop using them right now. So it has to be a phase down rather than a phase out. And I spoke to the leader of a developing country in the last few days, actually, who said, actually, developing countries really aren't properly ready to talk about phasing out fossil fuels. So is Sultan Al-Jaber just being honest?
Well, the reality is that when we talk about phase out, we are expecting a plan to emerge, which clearly mentions when and how we are going to phase out and who is going to do how much. We agree, and the whole world knows that you cannot ask countries like Colombia and or now Uganda or Timor-Leste to immediately stop extracting because their economies depend on it. There are so many workers who are depending on the fossil fuel industry. And let me also remind that this fossil fuel-based model has been promoted by the West that is now putting pressure on developing countries to act more without providing any money. So what we expect when we say phase out, we also say in the same breath, phase out in a just and equitable manner. So justice and equity are extremely important. You cannot expect Colombia and Uganda and Azerbaijan to phase out exactly the same time as Canada and the US or Saudi Arabia. All countries have different levels of responsibility, and that's why we keep saying the principle of equity is extremely important. And this particular process has been failing to really get down to those details, and that's why we have been demanding now that we need a new treaty in the form of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that complements Paris Agreement so that we can actually have a holistic conversation about phasing out of fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner.
Do you think you'll get that over the course of this conference?
Not in this conference, but something remarkable happened. There are already 11 countries now calling for such a treaty to be negotiated. And these countries include countries like Colombia and Timor-Leste. These are fossil fuel producer countries who have realized that this process is not going to help them. So imagine these are developing countries who are poor, who are dependent on fossil fuels for their revenues, yet they are making such a political commitment to phase out. But this particular process is not helping them. So the international cooperation on phasing out of fossil fuels is failing. We need to look at it afresh. We need a new agreement that can complement and really fill the void that exists in the current global framework.
Jerome, is likening these fossil fuel lobbyists, though, at this climate conference, likening them to arms dealers at a peace summit, do you think that's fair? Or let me ask you this, do climate activists need to engage people on the other side, and bringing them together in a forum like this can actually be productive in that sense?
No, I think there is no other side when it comes to the climate crisis. What we're demanding as activists at COP28 is polluters out, oil and gas companies out. We aren't saying lowering these emissions, we're saying we need to have a full phase out of them. And when we have conversations in which we try to humanize and say that the fossil fuel industry is somehow supporting global health, the fossil industry is the #1 issue that is stopping global health. I think that is really important when we talk about the climate crisis and the role of fossil fuel. Fossil fuels are stopping every process in every fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty talk because they are trying to have their own agenda pushed. I think that is really important when we have these discussions, is that we don't equate climate change and the climate crisis to have two sides. It is a side of on the people, or you're on the side of profits and the continuation of the destruction of our planet.
Jerome, do you think, being from the generation that you're from and being considerably younger than so many people at the table at COP28, gives you really a completely different perspective, because your fears for the failure of these conferences are completely different over the span of your lifetime compared to theirs?
Yes, I think that when a young person looks at their future, when we are interacting with nature, there is a very different feeling that young people feel than adults do. When I'm in nature, I feel a sense of ephemerality, thinking that maybe this nature and environment that I'm in might not exist next year. And maybe because of our inaction, we'll continue to see our communities be eroded and continue to be degraded because of our lack of investment in them. And adults don't see it that way because they have had decades upon decades to take action, but they haven't. And young people are barely getting into their 20s and 30s and realizing that the future around us is collapsing because of past generations' selfishness. And I think that is really a key difference in our perspective, because also when young people are at conferences like COP28, we come from the perspective of thinking of systems in a completely new way. Older people and our elders and adults have lived within systems for decades and have become normalized by their confines, and think that capitalism and the norms that it creates are the only barriers that we can live within. But as young people, we think about those barriers differently and say, why are we not breaking down those systems? Why are we not building new ones that prioritize people and planet over the exploitation of our communities? Okay. And I think young people are very passionate and very have a sense of moral clarity in which we're able to cut through that jargon and able to say enough is enough. Let's talk real, let's talk sensible, let's talk equity, and not just talk about how our economy should be the only thing that people are focused on. It should be people that they're focused on.
Okay. Bill, let me ask you then, from here on out, I mean, what really are the consequences of not meeting even the basic goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, for example? And I mean, is it time as well to maybe stop talking about that 1.5 degree cap? Aren't we just already there, and we need to be focusing now on mitigating the damage?
Yeah, look, it's a fundamental question, and Jerome's right. I mean, everyone, young or old, needs to be panicking about the present situation. We've seen massive heat waves, huge floods and disasters this year, just at 1.2 degrees warming, 0.3 degrees short of the global Paris Agreement limit. And I think the lesson I'm taking away from that is just how important the Paris 1.5 degree limit is. We know the International Energy Agency is saying it, the scientific community is saying it. We know if we could get fossil fuel emissions down by 40% by 2030, basically out of the system by 2050, that we can still limit warming very close to 1.5 degrees. So I think we have to keep that goal centrally in mind. The other thing is that around the world now, people are benefiting from the rollout of renewables. As my colleagues have said, fossil fuels are causing massive health problems, massive economic problems. They're not helping energy security. We know that it's cheaper to go down the renewable pathway. We know it's better for the environment. We know it's better for everyone. And the challenge here at this meeting, at this COP, is to move past the fossil fuel paradigm. I mean, I've been in this business now for 30 years, without apology, also pushing for, I think we first called for a fossil fuel phase out in the mid-1990s. So deeply frustrating, deeply angering, very concerning to see so many fossil fuel lobbyists here. But this COP is just so important politically to close the gap between what the scientists are calling for, what youth are calling for, what civil society is calling for, and what the politicians are actually doing. Yeah. This gap has got wider and wider, and in some way, the COP president symbolizes that.
Yeah,
and the challenge for him.
I want to come back to the host then quickly, Bill, and if you can try to help us understand, I mean, what is a country like the United Arab Emirates left with if you take fossil fuels out of the equation? This would be a collapse of their economy. UAE, Saudi, other oil and gas, go ahead.
Absolutely. But the thing is that there are alternatives. So a place like the Emirates or Saudi Arabia can transition towards green energy, whether it's green hydrogen, green ammonia, or renewable-based industries, this is possible. If you wait until it's too late and for the fossil fuel markets to completely collapse before you do it, then you'll go broke, right? But with a staged transition, that doesn't have to happen. Countries can invest and are investing in the alternatives. Right now in the Emirates, though, the balance is all wrong. We're looking at a 40% increase in oil and gas production by 2030. We're seeing 150 billion investment in new oil and gas. We're seeing only about 10% of that in renewables. It needs to be switched around the other way. And that's a frustration that everyone's got about this. These oil-producing countries, oil-producing companies have massive amounts of resources. And the Secretary General said it, the International Energy Agency said it, the companies simply have not got their act together to change that investment pathway. And the fact they're not doing it could basically wipe them out economically, but there's a massive and great future coming if we can make that transition away from the past into the future.
Okay, Harjeet, let's try to see if we can end with the glass being half full and maybe look at the achievements so far at COP28. There is an agreement to fund poor countries affected by climate disasters, and more than $2 billion will go toward preserving forests, oceans, and what did they say, defeating neglected tropical diseases, I think was the phrasing. Is this a net positive then, as far as the upside of COP28 is concerned?
Well, there has been a flurry of announcements and declarations, but if you put them together, they don't really add up to the challenge that we are facing right now. And there's a huge disconnect also between what is being announced on the outside, which has no legal standing, by the way, and what must be negotiated within the conference room. We are here at UNFCCC to come up with an agreement that is legal so that we can hold countries to account. And you see the announcement of these billions coming through, but at the same time, the text on fossil fuel phase out is being blocked. The language on finance is extremely weak. This is not how we are going to be able to solve the climate crisis. If we are really serious, we need to be scaling up to a level which is commensurate to the crisis, which means we need hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, for the entire climate action, we are now talking of trillions, which COP27 last year did mention. So that's the scale of money that is needed. You know, a couple of billions here and there are not going to help. And this is where rich countries are failing. Absolutely, UAE as the host of COP28 has a role to play. But let us not look away from countries like Australia, Canada, Norway, US, UK, who are continuing to expand fossil fuels. In fact, these 5 countries are responsible for more than 50% of oil and gas expansion plans over the next 3.5 decades. Imagine, they are the ones who have the resources of finance and technology, and they are the ones who claim to be climate leaders. But what are they doing? You know, it's hypocrisy of the highest order.
Are these COP conferences, very quickly, are these COP conferences worth it?
Absolutely. I think the question is whether they are working or not. I think that's a different question. The other question that we should be asking, who is not making them work? You tell me one other place where Malawi or Tuvalu or Nepal can raise serious questions. We can't expect G7 and G20s to deliver a climate mandate. They're too focused on their economy. They're too focused on profits. They're too focused on GDP growth. This is a place where theoretically all countries are equal, but there are some countries, rich countries, who are not making this place, become effective. That's where we need to put a spotlight on. Who is wrecking? Who are these the people who are obstructing the climate talks?
That will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all 3 of my panelists really so much for being with us. Great to have you all, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. I'll see you next time.